My name is Maria, I'm 30 years old, and for the past 6 years I've been a single mother. People hear those words and make assumptions, most of them wrong. They picture irresponsibility, mistakes, or some inability to hold a relationship together. What they rarely see is the grit it takes to keep moving when you're raising a child with one income, one set of hands, and one pair of tired shoulders. My son Lucas has been the axis of my world ever since his father decided that parenthood wasn't something he had the stomach for. One day he was there promising forever, and the next he was gone. No goodbye that mattered, just a string of excuses that eventually dwindled into silence. I never begged him to stay. I couldn't. I was too busy holding my infant in my arms, too aware that the little bundle depending on me deserved more than a mother who wasted tears on a man who walked away. Money has been my biggest battle ever since. I work hard, harder than anyone in my family ever gave me credit for. I pick up extra shifts when I can, freelance small projects when Lucas is asleep, and plan every grocery trip like a military operation. Coupons are my armor, thrift shops my allies. I've learned the art of stretching a single chicken into 3 meals, of sewing tiny rips in Lucas's jeans so he doesn't feel self-conscious at school. Every dollar has a job, every expense has a reason, and yet I never let Lucas feel the weight of those numbers. He sees love, not lack, and to me that's the only measure of success that matters. But to my family, especially my younger sister Jessica, none of that counted. Jessica was the golden child, though she was younger by 2 years. She had always been sharper with her tongue than with her mind, and my parents seemed to adore her for it. Where I brought home report cards lined with A's and worked summers to save for college, Jessica dated her way through expensive dinners, married into money, and became the family's symbol of making it. Her husband Ryan is a man who has made millions through a mixture of intelligence, charisma, and timing. To give credit where it's due, he's ambitious and disciplined in a way Jessica never was. They live in a house that looks like it belongs on the cover of an architectural magazine. Marble floors, glass walls, and a view that stretches out like a painting. I, on the other hand, live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment where the furniture doesn't match and the carpet is thin from years of wear. Yet somehow, every night when I close the door and tuck Lucas into bed, I feel rich in ways marble could never provide. Jessica never saw it that way. She carried herself as though my life were some kind of cautionary tale. Proof of what happens when you choose wrong. To her, my thrifted blouses and worn shoes weren't symbols of resourcefulness but markers of failure. She delighted in small humiliations, timed carefully to land in front of our parents or extended family. A dig at my car, an outdated Toyota that has never once left me stranded. A jab at my clothes, ignoring the fact that I can make a $5 thrift dress look elegant with enough confidence. Or the cruelest of them all, casually implying that Lucas would grow up disadvantaged because of me. The worst part wasn't her words though, it was the laughter they drew. My mother would hide her smirk behind a glass of wine. My father would chuckle and shake his head, like Jessica's cruelty was some charming form of wit. They acted as though I were too serious, too sensitive, when I didn't laugh along. But what they didn't understand was that silence was my shield. I refused to give Jessica the satisfaction of knowing she had cut me. I'd rather swallow my pride than let her see me bleed. And yet those moments stayed with me. They echoed in the quiet nights after Lucas was asleep, when the dishes were washed and the apartment sat in stillness. I'd replay her words, the smirks on my parents' faces, the heat rising in my chest as I smiled through the sting. Part of me wanted to stand up and shout, to list every sacrifice I'd made, every victory they couldn't see. But another part of me, perhaps the wiser part, knew it wouldn't matter. My family had already written me into their story as the weak one, the failure, the one who didn't measure up. No amount of explanation could change the script they'd chosen. Still, I endured it. I told myself that dignity lay in restraint, that my worth didn't need their applause to exist. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and maybe deep down, I believed that someday the truth would reveal itself, that my resilience, my sacrifices, my refusal to collapse under the weight of abandonment and judgment would mean something. I just never expected that moment to come in the middle of a Thanksgiving dinner. Dinner started fine, the way it always did when my mother decided she could still host something proper. China that creaked from age, a candelabra with one bent arm, the turkey browned to a practiced sheen, and the table stretched like a stage. The mahogany gleamed under the chandelier and the centerpiece of dried wheat and cranberries, looked as if it belonged in a magazine layout rather than on the sticky ring of my father's Sunday night scotch. Conversations skated along in safe channels, politics in small pats, the weather, Jessica's latest renovation triumphs, until Jessica found the perfect place to sharpen her knife. She didn't need to raise her voice to be cutting, she only needed an audience. She loved the way a well-placed barb ricocheted across a room, how it landed, how it made people look at you as if you were a problem that needed solving. Tonight she gave me that look. An evaluating half-smile, the tilt of someone ready to deliver an observation that would cement a reputation. Her eyes tracked the thrifted cardigan I wore, soft wool, 2 winters old, mended along one seam, and the speed with which she translated it into a punchline made my stomach drop. "Maria," she said, loud enough for the stemware to hear, "do you ever get tired of looking, well, like that? You know, broke." It happened the way humiliation always does, suddenly, and with a slow bloom that let every face register the change. Laughter rolled around the table like a tide. My mother's chuckle was practiced, the way she used it to let herself off the hook. My father slapped the table, not with malice, more with the performative shock of a man who loved his daughter's wit because it made him look clever by association. They were not laughing at a joke. They were laughing to reinforce a story they'd already chosen about me. Lucas glanced up from his mashed potatoes, little face earnest, then back to me. Kids have a brutal honesty. His confusion was an accusation. "Mom," he mouthed, and a tiny hand found mine under the table, a tether against the current. The heat in my face wasn't just embarrassment. It was the old, slow burn of being reduced in front of the only person whose need I'd ever felt purely, my son. Jessica leaned back with the smugness of someone whose life is an exhibit and whose spouse is the sponsorship. She had reasons for being ruthless. She wasn't cruel out of emptiness, she was strategic. Marrying Ryan had given her a second life, one of social proof and visible success, and every slight against me was an investment in that life. When she mocked my clothes, she was also rewinding her own insecurity into capital, positioning herself as the family's champion of good choices. To her, my vulnerability was a currency she could spend to buy admiration. To my parents, laughing at me was a public confirmation that their good kid had chosen well. They needed that narrative to keep their world tidy. There is a violence to that kind of social accounting. My parents had always been people who measured value in visible increments: houses, trophies on shelves, the right schools attended. My mother still called Jessica accomplished the way you might praise a trophy, not a person. My father preferred storylines where every decision was a tidy cause and effect. My thrifted cardigan didn't fit that arithmetic. It disrupted their template of how to feel proud, so they dismissed it, and me, rather than sit with the discomfort. I felt every micro-gesture around the table as if it were a blade. The napkin at my elbow, the tilt of my father's chin, the way my mother's laugh hit the ceiling and refracted back to me like judgment. I wanted, with a primitive feral urgency, to stand up and make them hear the ledger of my life. The nights I worked extra shifts, the scholarship I clawed my way through in college, the nights I held Lucas and learned to braid hair with tired fingers. I wanted to list the ways I'd kept us afloat. How I learned to price match, how I taught myself to fix a leaky sink, how I could make a school permission slip look like an event. But the words lodged in my throat because they never landed where I needed them to land. Explanations were a poor currency at a table paid in condescension. So I swallowed. I had learned, through years of being the family's perceived underdog, that silence could be armor. If I answered, Jessica would sharpen her blade. If I retorted, my parents would laugh harder because it fed the drama they preferred to the discomfort of truth. I had built my dignity on restraint. Besides, Lucas' eyes were the true mirror here. He needed to see composure that didn't crumble when insulted. My son's sense of self depended less on my explanations than on the steadiness of my face. The room kept moving, voices overlaying each other, the clink of spoons against plates, the low hum of a football game murmuring from the living room. But the laughter had changed rooms into cages. I kept breathing, counting the beats between each inhalation, and tried to make my face neutral, trained like a professional who'd performed the same small endurance for years. Nod, smile, keep your mouth tidy. Inside, fury coiled into a neat, dangerous thing that I refused to unleash. It was not the moment to start a fight. It was the moment to conserve strength. Jessica, sensing victory, softened her voice into the familiar poison of folk sympathy. "I mean, not everyone can marry well, at least try. It's embarrassing." The sentence wasn't about my clothes. It was an indictment of my life choices, a verdict she delivered for the applause it would earn. She wanted a reaction, but she did not expect the silence that met her to be a kind of refusal. She wanted me to look small so she could look bigger, and she banked on my parents to validate that inflation. My father laughed again, but this time there was a tightness around his eyes I'd never liked. Approval for Jessica's cruelty sat next to an older man's fear that the stories he taught himself to live by might unravel. My mother's hand smoothed her napkin with a slight tremor. People who choose comfort over truth do not like to be reminded of the fragility of their choices. And then, in the midst of that practiced theatricality, Ryan, quiet, composed, and usually detached from family drama, put down his fork. "Jessica," he said sharply, and the laughter died like a TV with the cord pulled. His voice carried weight, calm, exact, the kind of authority that didn't need volume because it already owned the room. He looked at my parents first, as if he were measuring them. "Do you realize Maria is the reason my company just closed a $5 million deal last month?" Sound collapsed inward. My fork slipped and clattered against my plate, a small, obscene percussion in the sudden hush. The conversation that had been orbiting polite small talk disintegrated into a charged quiet where every inhale felt loud enough to be heard. Jessica's smirk froze mid-curve, like a photograph of smugness someone had accidentally left in the light. My mother's hand hovered halfway to her glass. My father, who loved a punchline more than the truth, blinked slow and hard. "What are you talking about?" Jessica managed, all at once thin and loud, the way a person who knows her footing is gone will shout to build an illusion of stability. Ryan leaned forward. His hands were flat on the table now, not in accusation but in assertion. That government contract, the logistics tender with the complicated delivery windows and the compliance matrix no one wanted to rewrite. It's on us because Maria connected me with the right contact, walked me through the evaluation criteria, and sat with our proposal until it read like a perfect fit. She vouched for me when everyone else wrote us off. She gave me her time, her research, and her trust. Without her, it never would have happened. The words themselves were factual and modest, but what they did to the room was disproportionate. I heard the way my name sounded, spoken with the kind of gratitude that makes your chest sting. Gratitude has a sound. It is not performance. It landed like an unexpected repayment of decades of silence. I remembered that call as clearly as if it had been yesterday. It had been 3 nights of frantic emails, one 6-hour stretch of me hunched over my laptop while Lucas slept, redrafting clauses and annotating the proposal with procurement jargon that hadn't been my everyday for years, but still lived in the corners of my brain. I had once been a subcontractor's logistics analyst. I knew solicitation numbers and the boxes procurement officers wanted ticked. When Ryan called, desperation in his voice, I listened. He explained the gaps in their narrative, the lack of a clear past performance story for cold chain operations, the sloppy timeline for phased rollouts, the absence of cost-benefit evidence for their proposed staging hubs. I rewrote sections, suggested where to add measurable KPIs, and recommended a contact at the agency whose attention to specificity could tilt the scales. I made introductions I'd cultivated years before, an old colleague who understood how to translate industry experience into government language. We worked through red lines until his bid read like a blueprint the reviewers could not ignore. I had never mentioned it. Why would I? Ragging felt vulgar. The work had been help, nothing to trumpet. Part of me had thought it trivial, another part of me wanted to hold something unbreakable to myself, a quiet proof that I still had skills, that I could still open doors without asking anyone for permission. When Ryan called with the good news, an offer on the table that would double revenue for the quarter, he said simply, "I couldn't have done it without you." I'd accepted the gratitude and folded it into the late night where it lived, small and warming. But to be the unseen hand behind a multi-million-dollar deal was, in my family's arithmetic, an inconvenient truth. Their schema of worth relied on spectacle, a house with marble floors, a title that fit on a business card, visible tokens of success. My help had been invisible, unadorned by press releases or plaques. So they laughed when Jessica chose to make me a spectacle, certain that their merriment would go unpunished. Ryan's next sentences were not loud. They were measured, precise. "Do you sit here mocking her thrift clothes while she's the reason we can afford our expansion? Do you think your jokes mean anything when there are families on the payroll whose paychecks depend on this work?" He didn't smile. There was no flourish, only the clean iron of a man refusing to let a story be simplified into cruelty. His motivation was plain and honest. Gratitude for a debt repaid, yes, but more than that, disgust at a cruelty he refused to endorse. He had watched Jessica perform superiority like a badge because it made her fragile self look whole. He had watched why parents equate success with visibility and had seen them strip nuance to create comfort. Ryan couldn't abide that simplification when the consequences were real: jobs saved, vendors kept, a small company's trajectory turned because someone chose to step up. To him, that wasn't about status, it was about responsibility. Standing up for me wasn't a dramatic flourish, it was a simple accounting of cause and effect, and an ethics check on his family's cruelty. Jessica's face moved through shades of surprise, then anger, then the flail of someone whose joke has become an accusation against herself. "You're making this up," she spat. You expect us to clap because you got lucky with help." The contempt was a reflex. She tried to reduce the moment back into theater where she could still direct the applause. But the room had shifted. My mother's shoulders were tight, the practiced chuckle wiped clean from her face. My father's joke reservoir had run dry. They'd traded the comfort of a simple narrative for the discomfort of complexity. What happens when the person they deemed a failure is the one who quietly keeps things from collapsing? The laughter that had once knit them together had nowhere to land now. It looked small and brittle against the revelation. I felt something unexpected and not entirely comfortable rise in me, pride twined with a sharpened sorrow. Pride, because the value of my labor had been recognized in terms they understood: dollars and saved livelihoods. Sorrow, because it had taken public vindication from my sister's husband to make them see me. I had always hoped the truth would be enough, that my life's arithmetic would tally for someone without the spectacle. But ordinary facts are often invisible until someone you did not intend to need speaks them aloud. Ryan's final words, the ones he used not to humiliate but to reframe, hung in the air like a verdict and a reprieve. You don't get to belittle someone who quietly does the hard work of keeping people's lives together. He looked directly at me then, not with pity, but with a steady, accountable respect that felt foreign and warm. The rest of the table had nothing quick to say, only that sticky silence of people whose assumptions had been unsettled. In that suspended moment, the dynamics at the table changed. Whether they would change for good, whether my family would recalibrate what they valued, was something I could not yet know. What I knew with an odd, bright clarity was this: for the first time in a long time, someone at that table had corrected their story about me in public. It did not erase the years of mockery, but it did fracture them enough for light to get through. The silence that followed Ryan's words was not empty. It was dense, like the hush after a stone drops into still water and every ripple holds attention hostage. My mother's practiced smile, one she wore as easily as a favorite brooch, fell away as though someone had unclipped it for inspection. Her hands, which had been busy arranging napkins as if to steady the room, stilled. My father's face took on that peculiar brittleness I'd seen once before at graduations and awards. He looked as if he'd swallowed glass and was trying not to cough. Jessica's color moved through the spectrum of exposure, the quick flare of embarrassment, the burn of anger, the blanching pallor of someone who suddenly realizes the joke has turned back on her. She never told us that," my mother said, words stumbling like a child on icy steps, each intonation begging the floor to open and take them. "Because she's humble," Ryan said, and the way he said it, flat, final, wasn't theatrical. It was a filing of truth into record. "Unlike the rest of you." I felt Lucas's fingers against mine beneath the table, a small, steadying pressure that was both reassurance and a reminder of why I had learned to hold my tongue for so long. His grip anchored me to the immediate, the plate in front of me, the smear of gravy on its rim, the chandelier casting a familiar glow. For a breath, I let my chest fill with that simple, quiet recognition. For the first time since this had begun, someone at the table had reframed my life in terms that mattered to them. Recognition has a weight. It settles into your bones and teaches them how to stand differently. Jessica, who had spent years refining the craft of magnifying other people's flaws to hide her own, tried the reflex she always tried: derision. "Well, I mean, still, it's not like she's..." Her sentence fell apart because whatever adjective she meant to use was suddenly inadequate. How do you reduce a person whose actions have ripple effects measured in livelihoods to a single slur? She had been practicing dismissal so long that when the script shifted, she didn't have a next line. Ryan cut her off. Stop. You don't get to diminish her. She's more valuable than you give her credit for. And frankly, I'm ashamed you treat her this way." Those words landed like a verdict. Shame is a particular kind of language. It doesn't merely accuse, it exhumes a moral ledger and forces people to read their own transactions. My parents, who had traded nuance for neat stories their whole lives, slid uncomfortably under that beam. Their laughter had always been a form of economy. By belittling me, they could invest more pride in Jessica's choices and make their family narrative neat and digestible. Now that ledger was being recalculated in real time. I watched them try to find a new balance. My mother's hands, which had been restless, smoothed the napkin the way someone smooths fabric over a wrinkle they do not want anyone to notice. My father offered a laugh that was thin and failing, like a man trying to patch a hole with tape. They had lived by appearances, marble, titles, curated success, and those measures felt suddenly insufficient against an account that counted impact and quiet competence. For them, the revelation was not just about me. It was a small, destabilizing proof that their definitions might be incomplete. Jessica's eyes flashed with something like panic. She rummaged for bravado and found only thinness. Her voice frayed at the edges. To understand Jessica is to understand that her power came from audience. She had learned young that sharp words could command a room. They were a currency that bought attention when she feared being invisible. Married to a man who validated her in public ways she lacked privately, she weaponized humor to secure status. Tonight, the currency changed hands. Ryan's posture was the posture of someone who had weighed his conscience and decided to spend it. He had reasons beyond gratitude for speaking. He was not simply repaying a favor. He was refusing complicity in a cruelty he had watched become habitual. I had seen that cruelty eat at the edges of family dinners for years, an accepted ritual that allowed people to feel superior without confronting their own choices. Ryan, who had built a life on measurement and consequence in business, could not abide the casual arithmetic of humiliation. As the conversation stalled into awkwardness, I understood more clearly than I ever had the mechanics of my family's judgment. They did not hate me because I had failed, they feared the mirror. If I, the child who'd chosen differently, who'd stayed when someone else had left, turned out to be the one holding a quiet ledger of competency, then the tidy stories they told themselves about who succeeded and who failed might need rewriting. People who invest in simple narratives cling to them because narratives reduce uncertainty. My life, messy and relentless and stubbornly ordinary, was a threat to that order. I felt anger, sharp and clean, but I also felt a deeper, quieter thing. Relief braided with exhaustion. Relief because the truth had been spoken in a way that could not easily be laughed away. Exhaustion because vindication by proxy felt like an odd currency. I had wanted to be seen for what I did, not because someone else shouted it aloud. Still, there was consolation in the crack that had opened in their certainty. Where light comes through a rupture, something can change. Around me, tableware resumed its clinking, but the sound was different, less a soundtrack to merriment, more a staccato of people reclaiming composure. The air had cleared of jest and become heavy with consideration. My parents' faces were not triumphant. They were small and private in a way that made me ache with compassion for them. They were not demons. They were people clinging to comforts that felt safer than the unease of growth. For the first time in years, I was not the family's cautionary tale. I was a presence they couldn't easily reduce. The power at the table had shifted, not into a place of revenge, but into a quiet restoration of dignity. I felt seen, yes, but the sight was not blinding. It was an even, hard light that promised not spectacle but consequence. The consequence of truth spoken in public, of assumptions exposed, and perhaps of habits that might begin to be rethought. I did not stand. I did not demand apologies. I let the moment sit where it was solid, awkward, irrevocable, and listened to the new silence, which was not empty anymore. After dinner, the house held that strange, brittle quiet that comes after a small moral earthquake. Forks hesitated in midair, conversation dissolved into the polite murmur of people searching for the next comfortable thing to say, and the candlelight made everyone's faces look softer, less like combatants and more like people who had just been caught off guard. Dessert sat untouched on plates, pumpkin pie half-eaten, a smear of whipped cream clinging to an edge. My mother rearranged her hands on her lap like someone checking for bruises. Jessica kept pretending to study the pattern on the tablecloth. My father cleared his throat twice, like he wanted to tell a story that would stitch the night back together. Ryan leaned across and said quietly, "Maria, can we step into the kitchen for a second?" He did not ask in the performative way he'd once used to invite guests into a show home. This was practical, steady. I followed him through the sliding doors where the hum of the refrigerator and the smell of coffee grounds gave the room an ordinary honesty. The overhead light above the sink was too bright after the chandelier, and his face looked human, less a silhouette of success and more a man with his guard down. He shut the doors softly and faced me. His eyes, which I had always known as the kind that measured risk and reward, were earnest now. "You don't owe them explanations," he said, the words deliberate and clear. "But you do deserve respect. I'll make sure you get it." There was a promise in that sentence that could have been hollow. People make pronouncements in domestic trenches all the time. But his voice carried the authority of someone who understood consequence. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering intervention. I saw, briefly, the calculus of his life. He was used to outcomes and to moving levers until things balanced. That impulse had always been disconcerting to me when it came with privilege, but in this moment it was a balm. He wasn't rewriting history or glossing the wounds. He was simply refusing to let them continue as they had, refusing to normalize cruelty dressed up as wit. I nodded. I wanted to say so much, everything that would have cut loose years of silence. The nights I counted grocery receipts to make sure rent wouldn't squeal by. The shifts I took till my back ached. The times I fixed a leaky bathroom pipe with a YouTube tutorial at midnight so Lucas wouldn't have to miss school. I wanted to catalog the small economies that kept our life steady. Coupons clipped with a precision that looked almost like devotion. Thrift finds transformed into outfits Lucas wore to school with a pride I hadn't bought for him with cash but with time. Instead, I let the hush between us hold the truth. There was dignity in restraint. There was power in letting someone else name the thing you had been. "Thank you," I said simply. It felt inadequate and enormous at once. He gave a half smile, the kind that doesn't erase complexity but acknowledges it. "You don't have to do it alone," he added, as if that were a line between us, a small bridge. Then he turned back toward the dining room. The conversation there had resumed its low, careful thread. Chips of laughter fell like cautious stones. I walked back in feeling lighter in a way that surprised me. The weight of being the family's failure had been redistributed, even if just for one evening. That night, after the last dish had been rinsed and the tea had gone lukewarm, I carried Lucas up the narrow stairs to his bedroom. His small room was a curated clutter of superhero sheets, a stack of library books with bent spines, a nightlight shaped like a dinosaur, and a hand-drawn spaceship taped to the wall. He rubbed his eyes, hair sticking up in unpredictable directions, and I thought of how different our lives looked from outside and how intimately beautiful the ordinary parts were. The crumpled sheet with a grass stain I hadn't managed to remove, the pencil-scrawled grocery list tacked to the wall, the dent in the couch where we both read on Sundays. I sat on the edge of his bed and tucked the blanket around his shoulders. He watched me, the way children watch a trusted ritual, no guile, no calculation. "Mom," he said, voice small and sure, "I'm proud of you." He whispered it as if the words were his treasure and he wanted to keep them safe between us. The sound of that whisper was a physical thing. It hit the soft spot beneath my sternum and made my hands tremble. I blinked until tears blurred the edge of his face. The room swam in a way that made everything more tender. His breath was hot and steady. The smell of the lavender detergent I used on his pajamas rose like a memory I wanted to freeze. I pressed my forehead to his, feeling the small, even rise and fall of his chest, and let the tears come. They were not performative, no sudden epiphany in front of people who'd finally seen me. They were the accrual of years, the quiet humiliations swallowed at holiday tables, the nights I answered work emails while rocking a sick child, the countless thrifted coats and patched knees. Each tear was a ledger entry. Sacrifice, yes, but also a record of endurance. The pool of salt on my cheeks felt like an inventory of the work I had done that had never been acknowledged in terms the world cared for until tonight. It was strange and satisfying not because I'd been publicly exalted, but because my son, the only dependable witness to most of my days, acknowledged the cost and the value in terms that mattered. Pride from your child is not an ornament. It is confirmation that what you chose to do, to stay, to protect, to sacrifice, translated into something visible to the person whose life you were building. That kind of acknowledgement dissolves arrogance and makes room for something truer, worthy tiredness, proud persistence. I lay there for a long time after he fell asleep. the room quiet except for the faint drone of the city beyond our window and the muffled sounds of the house settling. I thought of marble floors and glass walls and the way some people equate worth with display. I thought of the small economies that keep a child fed and in shoes that don't fall apart midwinter. I realized, with a clarity that was almost quiet violence in its simplicity, that what I had been taught to consider defeat had often been an act of craft. A management of resources, an exercise of devotion, a careful inheritance without ceremony. Victory, I discovered, didn't require a parade. It arrived in a whisper from a 6-year-old and a single deliberate promise from a man who could have stayed silent. It arrived in the small personal arithmetic that finally got translated into a language my family understood. The triumph was not in changing them overnight, but in the knowledge that for the first time in a long while, their picture of who I was had a crack through which truth could be seen. I cleaned my face with the sleeve of my sweater and stood in the doorway a long minute, watching my son breathe in the dim light. The word unstoppable felt dramatic and maybe a little dangerous, too neat for a life that had been messy and dependent on small mercies. But beneath the caution was something more precise: steadiness, the kind that comes from surviving long enough to be witnessed, and from realizing that resilience, sacrifice, and quiet intelligence could be their own kind of capital. For now, that was enough. Because finally, they saw me,